It was a morning like any other in Harmony Creek, a quiet, isolated town nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and nothing ever seemed to happen. But on April 12, 2011, something happened that would shake this peaceful town to its core. Sarah Jenkins, a bright 21-year-old nursing student with a future full of promise, had disappeared. No warning, no sign of struggle, just gone. Detective Robert "Rob" Kincaid had seen his fair share of missing person cases. He'd solved most of them, but something about this felt different. As the sun rose over the mist-covered hills, Rob stood at the edge of the Jenkins family's rural property. The scent of pine and fresh dew hung in the air, but it was the heavy silence that spoke louder than anything else. It was the silence of dread. A mother had lost her daughter, and a community was on the brink of losing its faith in justice. "Rob, you need to see this," a voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Chloe Jenkins, Sarah's younger sister, clutching a tissue in her shaking hands. Her eyes were wide with fear, still raw from the horror of what had happened. She pointed toward the tree line where the family's logging trail disappeared into the thick woods. "I saw him," Chloe whispered. "The man who took Sarah. He was wearing camouflage, and he led her toward the woods." Chloe was in no condition to talk, but she needed to. Rob knelt beside her, his experienced eyes taking in the rawness of her grief. "Can you tell me more about the man? Was he someone you knew?" Her eyes welled up with tears. "I thought it was Marcus. He always wore camo when he came over, but I'm not sure." Marcus. The friend Chloe had trusted. Rob had seen no signs of foul play between Marcus and Sarah, but the mention of his name triggered something deep inside him. He hadn't thought about Marcus yet, but Chloe's words planted a seed of doubt. It was a small clue, maybe too small, but Rob had learned long ago that even the smallest clue could unlock a chain of events. Turning toward the forest, Rob unhooked his canine partner, Zeus. The German shepherd stood alert, his dark eyes scanning the trees. He was more than just a dog to Rob. He was a partner, a silent witness to the world of crime that Rob had been immersed in for nearly 2 decades. They'd become a well-oiled team, each trusting the other's instincts without question. "Find her," Rob said softly, as Zeus sniffed the ground, his body tense and ready for action. The K9 took the scent from Sarah's abandoned backpack, sniffing the straps before lifting his nose to the air. Rob watched as Zeus started moving, nose to the ground, tracking the scent with precision. The scent led them to the edge of the woods, right where the logging trail split off from the dirt road. For a moment, Zeus seemed to pause, his nose twitching. Then, without warning, the scent line vanished. Zeus circled back and forth, air scenting, but there was nothing to follow. The woods were eerily quiet. The trail had gone cold. Rob stood there for a moment, trying to piece together what had happened. He had seen this before, cases where the scent simply disappeared. He glanced around the area, his trained eye catching the subtle details others might miss. This wasn't just an abandoned trail. There was something more here. A vehicle. A car or truck had come and gone, likely parked where the trail ended. "Zeus, let's go," Rob muttered. The canine obediently followed him as they retraced their steps back to the clearing. Rob's mind raced with possibilities. Who could have taken Sarah? And why was the scent leading them nowhere? The lack of a clear direction left more questions than answers. Later, as the day wore on, Rob stood at the sheriff's office, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders. The Jenkins family had been frantically calling every possible lead, every possible person who could have seen something, but so far nothing. And then there was Chloe's statement. The man in camouflage. Rob could feel it. There was something about that detail, something that stuck with him. The camouflage. It was so simple, yet it felt like the key to unlocking a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. He needed more. He needed to know everything about Marcus. The next few hours passed in a blur of interviews, dead ends, and empty streets. Rob returned to the Jenkins house late in the afternoon. Chloe had already gone home, but her mother, Karen, was still there. She stood by the porch, staring out into the distance, her face etched with the exhaustion of too many sleepless nights. Karen looked at Rob, her eyes red from crying. "Any word?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "We're still working on it. We've got some leads, but nothing solid yet." Karen's gaze turned to the trees. "My Sarah. She was always so full of life. Now she's just gone." Rob's heart sank. He had seen too many families like this, broken by loss, desperately clinging to any hope. But Rob was a realist. He couldn't promise her anything. He could only work the case until the truth came to light, even if that truth would be darker than she could imagine. It wasn't much, but Rob had one thing he could count on: Zeus. The dog's sharp instincts might just be the key to cracking this case wide open. And that night, as Rob walked through the darkened streets of Harmony Creek, he knew one thing for sure: the trail wasn't over yet. The small town of Harmony Creek had been a place of refuge, where everyone knew each other by name, and the air was always thick with the smell of pine and fresh grass. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. But now, after 3 long years, Sarah Jenkins' disappearance was still a shadow that loomed over everything. Time had not been kind to Sarah's family. What began as frantic calls, searches, and hopeful prayers turned into a routine of despair. The hope that Sarah would walk through the door, smiling like she always had, was now a memory, faint and fading. Her mother, Karen, still kept the porch light on every night, as if the simple act would bring her daughter back. The light flickered softly in the evening air, a reminder of the hole Sarah had left behind. For Rob Kincaid, the case had become a weight on his chest. The once bustling investigation had slowed to a crawl. There were no more volunteers searching the woods, no more endless tips flooding in. The evidence, or what little there was, had dried up long ago. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were still out there, buried in the dense Appalachian forest that surrounded the town. Rob leaned back in his chair at the sheriff's office, looking at the evidence board. The case had started out like so many others: a missing person, a handful of clues, and a race against time to find the truth. But the more he investigated, the more everything seemed to spiral into dead ends. The man in camouflage that Chloe had seen leading Sarah into the woods. Rob had tracked down every possible lead, but none of them had panned out. No sign of the man, no sign of Marcus, the friend Chloe had initially suspected. Marcus had an airtight alibi. "Hey, Rob," came the voice of his partner, Detective Miller, breaking through his thoughts. Rob looked up, shaking off the weariness that had settled deep into his bones. "What's up?" "Got something," Miller said, walking over with a small Ziploc bag. Inside was a single weathered plastic zip tie, the kind used in logging operations. "Found this during a routine patrol. Thought it might be worth looking at." Rob took the zip tie, turning it over in his hands. It didn't look like much, just another piece of discarded garbage, but something about it nagged at him. He'd seen zip ties like this before, out in the woods where local logging crews worked. But why would this one be so far from the trail, buried beneath a pile of discarded hunting blinds? Zeus, his K9 partner, had been silent in the corner of the office, lying on his mat. Rob's hand instinctively moved toward his collar, and Zeus lifted his head, ears perked. The bond between them was unspoken but understood. Rob trusted Zeus more than anyone. "I'm going to run Zeus," Rob said, slipping on his jacket. Miller gave him a look but said nothing. It wasn't the first time Rob had followed a gut feeling on this case, and it wouldn't be the last. They drove to the edge of the national forest, the place where Sarah's scent had gone cold 3 years ago. The air was thick with the weight of the past, and the woods seemed to swallow them whole as they stepped out of the car. Rob clipped the leash onto Zeus's collar, and the dog stood, eager to work. Rob held the zip tie in his gloved hand, letting Zeus take a quick sniff. The dog immediately started pulling toward the same spot where they had been 3 years ago. This time, however, the trail didn't fade. Zeus moved with purpose, nose to the ground, weaving between trees, as Rob followed in his wake. The world Around them felt still, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. They reached the abandoned pile of hunting blinds, the same spot where Rob had lost the trail before. But this time Zeus didn't hesitate. The K9 began digging through the pile, his claws scratching at the dirt, and soon he unearthed something small, half buried in the soil. It was another zip tie.
Rob stared at it for a long moment, the puzzle pieces starting to click together. This wasn't just random garbage, it was deliberate. The ties had been used to restrain someone, Sarah maybe, and now they were tied to the very area where the trail had gone cold. Someone had intentionally left these items behind, scattered like breadcrumbs to throw off the investigation. Rob couldn't ignore the possibility. The tie wasn't from the initial crime scene. It was from a secondary location. "What do you think?" Miller asked from behind, his voice low. Rob didn't answer right away. His mind raced, but the facts were clearer than they'd ever been. There was one person who might have known this part of the forest better than anyone else. Daryl Tate. He was a local known for his low-level drug offenses, someone who'd been questioned when Sarah first went missing, but was cleared early on. But Rob couldn't shake the feeling that Tate knew more than he had let on. He knew these woods. He knew the back roads. "Let's pay him another visit," Rob said, his tone firm. Daryl Tate's trailer sat at the edge of town, shrouded in the overgrown weeds of neglect. It wasn't the first time Rob had been there, but something in the air felt different today. Miller stayed in the car, and Rob approached the door, knocking twice. Daryl opened the door slowly, his eyes wary. "What now, Kincaid?" "We've got questions," Rob said, showing the zip ties. "Where were you on the day Sarah Jenkins disappeared?" Daryl stepped back, his face hardening. "I told you 3 years ago. I didn't see anything." "We think you're lying," Rob replied, his voice steady. "We found something in the woods, and it points to you." Daryl's eyes shifted nervously, but he didn't say anything. Rob could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremble in his hands. "Where were you, Daryl?" Rob repeated, the weight of the question heavier this time. But Daryl just shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't have nothing to do with it." Rob held his gaze for a long moment before turning and walking back to the car. He knew this wasn't over. The zip ties were just the beginning, but they were enough to crack open a case that had been closed off for too long. Daryl Tate was hiding something, and Rob was going to find out what it was. Zeus, still in the back seat of the car, turned his head as Rob slid in beside him. The K9's gaze was steady, knowing that the hunt was far from over. For Rob, the hunt had never been about solving a case. It had always been about finding the truth. And now, with new evidence in hand, he was one step closer to bringing justice to Sarah Jenkins. The scent of the past was fading, but Rob could still smell the truth on the wind. The interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and old paperwork. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a cold, clinical light over the men inside. Detective Robert "Rob" Kincaid sat across from Daryl Tate, a man with a history of low-level drug offenses and a reputation for being just the kind of troublemaker who fit the profile of someone who could go unnoticed. Until now. Rob didn't waste time. "You're gonna help us with this, Tate," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know you're hiding something, and if you think you can keep skating by, you're wrong." Tate, a scruffy, disheveled man in his late 30s, leaned back in his chair. His arms were folded tightly across his chest, and his eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. He knew exactly why he was here. But that didn't mean he was going to make it easy. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective," Tate said, his voice low and slow, dripping with feigned innocence. "I ain't done nothing. I'm just here for the ride." Rob leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're a smart guy, Tate. We both know you're no stranger to the woods around here, especially that old logging trail. You probably even know exactly where it goes." Tate's eyes shifted, but he quickly recovered, wiping the expression off his face. "Yeah, I've walked those woods. Been up and down them all my life. Doesn't mean I had anything to do with Sarah Jenkins." The mention of Sarah's name had a noticeable effect on Tate. Rob saw it. The quick flicker in his eyes, the sudden tensing of his shoulders. He had something to hide, and Rob was going to make sure he cracked. "What's the deal with the zip tie we found near that logging trail, Tate? You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Rob asked, his tone casual but with a calculated edge. Tate shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flickering again. But this time, he didn't speak. Rob pressed on. "You know, Zeus picked up a trail that led straight to that zip tie. The K-9's been tracking that scent for days, and it brought us right to you." He leaned in a little closer. "That zip tie had a faint scent, yours and Sarah's. It matches the same boots you wear." Tate's breathing hitched, but he kept his face neutral, as if trying to suppress the truth buried deep inside. Rob could see the struggle, and Rob knew he was getting close. Every hardened criminal had a breaking point. Some just needed the right nudge. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tate muttered, shaking his head. "You've got nothing. That tie, I told you it's nothing." Rob wasn't buying it. He stood up and walked to the table, picking up a small laminated ID badge. He dropped it onto the table with a soft thud. The badge was worn, the corners frayed from years of use, but the name was still legible. Clayton Quarry. "You see this, Tate? This ID was found in your car. It's a badge from the Clayton Quarry, the old abandoned site just off the logging trail. You ever worked there?" Tate's face went pale, and his eyes widened for just a fraction of a second. It was enough for Rob to know that Tate had just felt the first wave of panic. He could already feel the confession simmering beneath. "The surface. You're bluffing," Tate spat, his voice rising. "That doesn't prove a damn thing." Rob smiled, unfazed. "Is that so? Because I have something else, too. Zeus tracked your scent, mixed with Sarah's blood, straight to that abandoned quarry. Funny how you'd have a key to the place, huh? Funny how you'd know it's the perfect spot to hide a body, if you had to." The room grew silent. Rob leaned against the table, watching Tate closely. He knew the moment Tate cracked would come soon, and when it did, everything would fall into place. Tate's breathing became shallow, his gaze darting between Rob and the ID badge. He fidgeted in his seat, trying to hold it together, but his composure was slipping. Rob wasn't going to make it easy for him. "You're not stupid, Tate. You know I'm not bluffing. You know you're trapped. So why don't you make this easy on yourself?" Rob's voice softened, a slight edge of sympathy creeping into his words. "Tell me where Sarah is. Help me put this all behind us." Tate's face twisted in a mixture of anger and fear. He stared at the badge for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he mumbled, barely above a whisper. We were just supposed to scare her. Just wanted to keep her quiet, make her go away." Rob's heart sank, but he didn't show it. He remained calm, letting Tate spill his confession. "We took her, me and Red, and John. We just needed her out of the picture. But things went wrong. She fought back, and then, well, we did what we had to do." The words hit Rob like a punch to the gut. The conspiracy he had suspected, 3 local men involved in the kidnapping, was true. And now, Tate was confirming it. "We moved her, took her up to the quarry. She was still alive when we got there. But she didn't last long." Tate's voice trembled as he spoke, his mind likely replaying the horror of what they had done. "She's out there, in the drainage ditch, just past the old mill. I didn't mean for her to die, but we had to keep her quiet." The confession hung in the air like a cloud of suffocating guilt. Rob's mind raced. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was murder. Cold-blooded, premeditated, and brutal. "Where is she, Tate?" Rob's voice was sharp now, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. Tate gave a low, defeated sigh, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. "The drainage ditch, behind the quarry, near the old mill. You'll find her there." Rob stood up without a word, his mind already shifting into action. He motioned for the officers outside to move. This was it. The lead they'd been waiting for. As Rob exited the interrogation room, Zeus followed close behind. The dog's expression remained calm, but Rob could sense the K9's relief, too. They were finally getting closer to the truth. They would find Sarah. Finally, and the town of Harmony Creek would never be the same again. The days stretched on, and with each passing hour, the tension in Harmony Creek seemed to grow heavier. Rob had seen the pain of families torn apart by loss before, but Sarah Jenkins's disappearance had felt different. The community, once full of life and chatter, now moved in slow, grieving silence. It had been 3 years since Sarah had vanished, without a trace, and despite the extensive searches, the case had gone cold. But then came the zip tie. Rob stood in the dense woods of the national forest, his boots crunching the leaves beneath him. The air was thick with humidity, and the faint smell of pine filled his lungs. Zeus, his K9 partner, paced ahead, his nose working the ground with precision. They were back on the trail, deep in the area where the search teams had abandoned their efforts years ago. It had been a long shot, a hunch, really, but Rob knew that sometimes the best leads came from unexpected places. The initial investigation had stalled, and nothing had panned out. The only thing that had ever given Rob hope was Zeus, whose instincts had never steered him wrong. The dog's nose twitched, and he suddenly darted off the path. Rob followed, pushing through the thick underbrush. It wasn't long before Zeus stopped in his tracks and began digging in a pile of discarded hunting blinds. Rob's heart rate quickened as he watched the K9 pull out a small, weathered object, a plastic zip tie. "What do we have here, boy?" Rob muttered under his breath, kneeling beside Zeus. The zip tie, covered in dirt and grime, seemed completely out of place. It was identical to the ones used by local logging crews, something Rob knew all too well. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the years of wear and tear. This wasn't just a piece of discarded trash. It was a clue. Where'd this come from? Rob thought aloud. Zeus, ever the silent partner, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. He stared up at Rob, his dark eyes full of intensity, waiting for his handler's next move. Rob couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in his stomach. It was a small piece of evidence, but it felt like a door opening, even if only slightly. Carefully slipped the zip tie into an evidence bag and stood up, surveying the area. Nothing around them seemed to explain its presence. No obvious signs of a struggle, no blood, no trace of Sarah. But something about the tie felt deliberate, like it had been placed there, waiting to be found. Rob headed back toward the sheriff's office. The weight of the case felt heavier than it ever had before. The Jenkins family, especially Karen, Sarah's mother, had lived with this grief for years. Every day was another day without answers. Rob had promised them he would get to the bottom of it. And now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally on the right path. Back at the office, Rob studied the zip tie again. It wasn't a bombshell. It wasn't a smoking gun. But it felt like it could be the missing link. Rob had a gut feeling that this would lead him to something bigger, something hidden beneath the surface. He began by checking the ownership of the land surrounding the area where the zip tie was found. The property was owned by Darrell Tate, a name that had come up before during the early investigation. Tate was a local offender with a history of drug charges, and his family had been in the area for generations. Rob remembered Tate from a brief interview 3 years ago, where he'd claimed to know nothing about Sarah's disappearance. He'd seemed almost too dismissive, too uninterested in the case. At the time, Rob had chalked it up to the arrogance of a man who thought he could get away with anything. But now, that arrogance seemed like something else. Rob's instinct told him Tate knew more than he had let on, and the zip tie was the key. Rob couldn't shake the feeling that Darrell Tate was hiding something big. The next day, Rob and Zeus made their way to Tate's property. The land stretched for miles, dense with forest and wild overgrowth. Rob's boots crunched against the gravel as he walked up to the old farmhouse, a structure that looked as if it had seen better days. The once white paint had chipped away, and the porch sagged with age. Rob knocked on the door, his hand steady, but his mind racing. Tate answered quickly, his expression cold, almost as if he were expecting Rob. He wore a weathered baseball cap and a tattered flannel shirt, his face rough and stubbled. "Detective Kincaid," Tate said, his voice low. "What can I do for you?" Rob took a deep breath. "We need to talk." Tate's eyes narrowed, but he stepped aside, allowing Rob and Zeus into the house. The inside was just as run down as the outside, with piles of old furniture and stacks of newspapers cluttering the space. Rob took a quick mental note of the disarray. Tate's life wasn't one of order, but it wasn't one of criminal mastermind either. There was something else to it, something beneath the surface. Rob didn't waste time. "We found something, Tate. A zip tie near the National Forest. It's the same kind used by local logging crews. What do you know about it?" Tate's jaw clenched, and his gaze darted to the side. Rob could see the wheels turning in his head, the realization that he was no longer in control of the conversation. "I don't know anything about it," Tate said, his voice growing defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rob leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We know you've been involved in shady stuff before, Tate. Drugs, theft. Now, we find a zip tie on your property. That's not a coincidence." Tate's face reddened, but he said nothing. Instead, he took a long drag from a cigarette, his fingers shaking slightly. "I'm not the one you should be looking at," Tate muttered, his eyes flicking to the window. There's more to it. I didn't do anything to that girl, but I know who did. Rob's heart raced. This was it. The breakthrough he had been waiting for. Tate had cracked, and Rob was about to get the answers he needed. Tate leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just me, Kincaid. There were others. People who live right here in Harmony Creek. They were the ones who made sure Sarah disappeared. And they'll do the same to you if you dig too deep. Before Rob could respond, Tate turned and walked out of the room, leaving Rob with more questions than answers. The case had just taken a turn into something much darker, and Rob knew without a doubt that the conspiracy was much bigger than he had ever imagined. The silence that followed Tate's exit was heavy, thick with the unspoken truth. Rob looked down at Zeus, who was still sitting at attention beside him, waiting for the next command. It was clear now. The Jenkins case wasn't just about finding Sarah. It was about unearthing a hidden world of secrets buried deep in the heart of Harmony Creek. And no matter what it took, Rob was going to find them. The courtroom felt suffocating, the air thick with anticipation. Harmony Creek was a town that hadn't seen a trial like this in decades, if ever. The community had been rocked by Sarah Jenkins's disappearance, and now, 3 years after the case had gone cold, the first crack in the wall of silence had finally appeared. But the cracks in the case ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Detective Robert "Rob" Kincaid sat at the back of the courtroom, his eyes fixed on the defendant in the dock, Darrell Tate, the man who had been cleared of suspicion years ago, now the center of a case that had grown from a missing persons file to something much darker. Rob could feel the weight of it all. The truth about Sarah's death had been hidden beneath layers of lies, and it wasn't just Tate who had played a role in that. The conspiracy was far bigger than anyone could have guessed. The jury filed in, their faces a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. Harmony Creek's tight-knit community had never been prepared for something like this. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Tate was a known local, a man whose reputation as a low-level offender had kept him off most people's radar. But there was something about him now, something different. The arrogance that had once served him well was now a mask, trying to hide the panic that was beginning to seep through his facade. Rob's partner, Detective Miller, was beside him, his eyes just as focused on Tate as Rob's. But today wasn't about solving the case. It was about sealing it. Today was about justice. Rob had to remind himself that, as much as he wanted to solve the case completely, he needed to trust the process. He had done his part, and now it was in the hands of the legal system. Gentlemen, ladies of the jury, today you will hear the full extent of what happened to Sarah Jenkins. The prosecutor began, his voice steady and commanding. A bright young woman with a future ahead of her, taken from her family, hidden away, and ultimately killed. We will show you how Darrell Tate played a role in this crime, but we will also reveal the deeper conspiracy that stretches beyond him. Dopfus watched Tate's face as the prosecutor spoke, studying every shift in his expression. Tate sat there, still and cold, but his eyes betrayed him. Rob had been in enough interrogations to know when someone was lying, and Tate's body language screamed guilt. But there was one thing that kept gnawing at Rob, the lingering question of who else was involved. Darrell Tate had confessed to helping move Sarah's body, but his confession was broken. It was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. There were still holes gaps in the timeline, unanswered questions. The zip tie, the quarry ID badge, and the DNA traces at the scene were all pieces of evidence that pointed to more than just Tate. But it was clear that Tate was holding something back. The question remained: who else had been involved? Who else had helped him? Later that afternoon, Rob was back at the office, his mind racing. The jury would be deliberating soon, but Rob couldn't sit still. He knew that the next big break would come from someone who had already been inside the circle of suspects. And there was one person left: Randy Red Miller, Daryl Tate's cousin. Randy had been arrested on a narcotics charge a few weeks ago, and Rob had been waiting for the perfect time to bring him in. He was the weak link in this whole thing, and Rob knew that the moment he cracked, the entire conspiracy would unravel. Rob wasn't one to believe in second chances, but he believed in pressure. The interrogation room was sterile, the walls a dull gray, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Randy Miller sat at the table, his eyes darting around the room nervously. He knew why he was here, and he didn't like it one bit. Robin Miller had crossed paths in the past, but this was different. This time, Rob wasn't letting him off the hook. "Randy," Rob began, his voice calm but authoritative. "You know why we're here. Your cousin's in the hot seat, and you're about to be too. You can either help us solve this, or we'll let you rot with him. Your choice." Randy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping on the table. He knew Rob was serious. His cousin Daryl might have been the one to help hide Sarah's body, but there was no way he acted alone. It was only a matter of time before Rob would get the truth. Randy exhaled sharply, his eyes darting away from Rob's piercing gaze. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he muttered, almost to himself. I just did what Daryl told me. He said Sarah would be fine, that she wouldn't be hurt, just held for a while. Held for a while." Rob's voice rose slightly. "For a while? Sarah Jenkins didn't deserve any of this. You're telling me she was just some pawn in a sick game, and you just stood by and let it happen?" Randy shifted again, clearly agitated now. "Look, it wasn't just Daryl. There was another guy, John. He was involved too. I don't know everything, but I know he helped. I didn't think it would go this far." John. The name echoed in Rob's mind like a gunshot. He'd heard that name before. John, a seemingly respectable local man who had a history of small-time work, but nothing that stood out. But now, he was a part of the conspiracy. That was the missing piece. "Tell me everything," Rob demanded, his voice unwavering. "I want to know what you know, all of it. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." As Randy slowly began to talk, filling in the details that had been missing for so long, Rob's mind worked quickly, piecing together the twisted truth behind Sarah's disappearance. John had been involved from the start, and the kidnapping had been carefully planned. Daryl Tate had been the muscle, but John had been the mastermind. Randy described how Sarah had fought against her captors, how she had tried to escape, how she had been held at an old cabin on the outskirts of town. Before being moved to the quarry, he described the moment when the men realized they had gone too far and how they'd made sure to hide the evidence, to bury the truth as deep as Sarah's remains. But it was clear from Randy's confession that he didn't want to be a part of it anymore. By the time the confession was complete, Rob had enough to take down John. But there was one last thing left to do: get a solid testimony to bring down Daryl Tate once and for all. Randy's cooperation was crucial, and Rob knew the trial was only the beginning. As he left the interrogation room, Rob felt a sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but it was close, and with Randy Miller's testimony, the case would be sealed. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, Rob allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The wheels of justice were turning, and soon Harmony Creek would know the truth. The courtroom was filled with the weight of grief and the cold anticipation of justice. Darrell Tate sat stoically at the defendant's table, his hands folded in front of him. He was no longer the cocky, arrogant man that Rob had interrogated in the past. Now, he looked like a man who had been stripped of everything, exposed for the monster he truly was. The years of lies, manipulation, and pain had all led to this moment, the trial for the brutal murder of Sarah Jenkins. Rob stood at the back of the courtroom, eyes fixed on Tate. His partner, Zeus, was with him, a reminder that the dog had been the key to unraveling this nightmare. Rob's heart was heavy as he thought about the hours spent working this case, the sleepless nights, and the moments of doubt. But now, the truth was laid bare for all to see. It had been 6 long years since Sarah's disappearance, and in that time, Rob had never given up. He couldn't. The memories of Chloe's tearful face, the desperate search for answers, and the haunting image of Sarah's family waiting for justice had driven him to this point. But it wasn't just the case that weighed on Rob. It was the bond he shared with Zeus. The dog had proven time and again that his instincts were sharper than any human's, and without Zeus's discovery of the zip tie in the woods, the case would have remained a cold file on a shelf. As the prosecutor laid out the evidence, Rob couldn't help but reflect on the twists and turns the case had taken. The zip tie had seemed like an insignificant clue at first, buried deep in the national forest, far from where Sarah had gone missing. But it was Zeus who had connected the dots, sniffing out a hidden truth that no one else could see. The zip tie had led them to Tate, and eventually to the grim discovery of Sarah's remains. The dog had found the truth, just as he always did. The courtroom fell silent as Randy Miller, Darrell Tate's cousin, and one of the secondary suspects, took the stand. Rob had always known that Randy was the key to breaking the case wide open. His testimony was gut-wrenching, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy to kidnap and murder Sarah. Randy's voice trembled as he described the events leading up to Sarah's abduction, her desperate fight for freedom, and the chilling moments that followed. He described how Darrell Tate and another man, John, had planned the kidnapping in advance, using their knowledge of the local back roads to get away unnoticed. It was a twisted plan, fueled by control and power, and it had cost Sarah her life. Zeus had been there from the beginning, and now it was clear that the dog's role in this case had been nothing short of heroic. The K-9 had led Rob to the truth when everyone else had given up. Zeus's persistence had uncovered the smallest piece of evidence, the zip tie, that had ultimately exposed the depth of the conspiracy. Without that one critical lead, Sarah's case might have remained another unsolved tragedy. As the jury deliberated, Rob took a moment to think about how far they had come. The case had been cold for years, with no new leads or suspects, and many had given up hope. But Rob hadn't, and Zeus hadn't. Together they had uncovered the truth, piece by painful piece, and now justice would be served. It wasn't just a victory for Rob and Zeus. It was a victory for Sarah's family, for the people of Harmony Creek, and for the silent, tireless workers who fought for justice behind the scenes. The trial was the final chapter in a long and painful journey, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. For Sarah's family, it was the end of their unbearable wait for answers. For Rob, it was the closure of a case that had haunted him for years. As the judge read the verdict, Rob stood up, his heart pounding. Guilty. The word rang out in the silent courtroom, and it felt like a weight lifting off his chest. Darryl Tate would be held accountable for his actions, and the community of Harmony Creek could finally begin to heal. The long search for Sarah's remains was over, and now her family could lay her to rest. Rob's eyes met Zeus's. The dog sat quietly by his side, his steady gaze unwavering. Rob couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and gratitude toward his partner. Zeus had been more than just a tool in the investigation. He had been a friend, a protector, and a symbol of hope when all seemed lost. It was a bond that went beyond words, beyond the job. It was the bond of two souls who had fought for justice together. After the trial, Rob and Zeus took a quiet walk through the mountains near Harmony Creek. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the land. For the first time in a long time, Rob felt a sense of peace. The silence around them was different now. Not the silence of dread, but the silence of something accomplished, of a job well done. Sarah's story had been heard, and justice had been served. As they walked, Rob couldn't help but think of the future. He knew that, like so many cases before, this one would stay with him forever. But it was a different kind of burden now. The kind that could be carried with pride. Rob was at peace with the outcome, knowing that the truth had finally come to light. And so, with Zeus by his side, Rob took one last look at the spot where the zip tie had been found, the place that had started it all. The silence of the mountains felt like a promise that justice, like the scent of a dog's nose, could never be extinguished. Thank you all for following Sarah's story and the journey of discovery that led to justice. What do you think about the role that canines play in solving cases like this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your thoughts mean a lot to me.